The Saturday morning had started like any other in the Riverside neighborhood of suburban Atlanta. The sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, promising another scorching summer day. By 2 p.m., the temperature had reached a sweltering 94 degrees, and most sensible people had retreated indoors to the comfort of air conditioning. Officer, however, was anything but indoors. He was patrolling the residential streets in his police cruiser, accompanied by his K-9 partner, Rex, a magnificent 70-pound German shepherd with a sleek black and tan coat that rippled with muscle. Had been a police officer for 14 years, and he had worked with K-9s for the past 8. He considered himself experienced, competent, and careful. Rex was a well-trained drug detection dog who had successfully identified narcotics in over 300 cases. Together, they were a formidable team, or so believed. That morning had rushed through his pre-patrol routine. He'd been running late because his daughter had an early soccer game, and he'd wanted to attend before heading to work. In his hurry, he'd done a quick visual check of Rex's collar, the leather strap that held the dog's identification and training credentials. It looked secure enough. He'd snapped on the lead, loaded Rex into the cruiser's specially equipped K-9 compartment, and hit the road. The police department had received an anonymous tip earlier in the week that a house on Maple Street was being used for small-scale drug distribution. Nothing huge, nothing that would make the evening news, but enough to warrant a Saturday sweep of the neighborhood. And Rex were among 4 K-9 units dispatched to conduct a routine patrol and check for suspicious activity. As they drove slowly down Maple Street, Rex occasionally perked up from his resting position, his nose working overtime to catch any scent carried on the warm breeze. This was what he was bred for, what he lived for, the thrill of the hunt, the chance to put his impressive olfactory abilities to work. Around 2:15 p.m., Officer turned onto Avenue, a tree-lined street with modest 2-story homes, well-maintained lawns, and white picket fences. Most of the houses showed signs of family life, toys scattered in yards, basketball hoops above garage doors, the occasional child's bike lying on its side in the driveway. It was the kind of street where families felt safe, where children played in sprinklers and neighbors waved from their porches. Was checking his clipboard, reviewing the address of the next house to survey, when something extraordinary happened. Rex suddenly lurched upright, his entire body rigid with alertness. His ears pinned forward and a low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. Before could fully process what was happening, the dog began barking, not the controlled alert bark that signaled detection of narcotics, but an aggressive, frenzied barking that had rarely heard from his partner. The sound was primal, wild, almost uncontrolled. Rex was pressed against the cruiser's rear window, his paws scratching at the barrier, his entire body trembling with what seemed to be rage or extreme agitation. "Whoa, boy, easy," said, turning to look at his partner. "What's wrong?" But Rex wouldn't settle. His barking intensified, and he lunged repeatedly against the barrier separating him from the front of the vehicle, pulled the cruiser to the side of the road near a residential property surrounded by a white wooden fence. The house appeared quiet, but through the fence slats could see a glimpse of blue, a swimming pool. The dog must have caught the scent of another animal, thought. Maybe a cat or another dog on the property. This wasn't unusual. K-9s often reacted to other animals, though Rex's intensity was surprising. Made a decision that would change everything. He decided to exit the vehicle and investigate, to see if he could calm Rex and determine what had triggered such an extreme reaction. He was the dog's handler, after all, and he knew how to manage him. Walked around to the rear of the cruiser and opened the compartment door. He reached in to attach the lead to Rex's collar, a standard procedure before removing the dog from the vehicle. His fingers found the collar, the leather strap that he'd checked in such a hurry that morning, and unhooked the door latch. What happened next occurred with shocking speed. As soon as the barrier was removed, Rex exploded forward with the force of a bullet. The dog's collar, which had visually inspected but not thoroughly checked, had been slightly loose. Years of wear and the stress of the dog's desperate lunging had created a gap just wide enough. As Rex catapulted forward, his neck twisted, his muscular frame twisted, and the collar simply slipped off. The lead, still attached to the collar, fell uselessly to the ground. "Rex, no, Rex, come," shouted, but his voice was lost in the chaos. The 70-pound dog bolted toward the fence, and with the power and determination of a trained police canine, he crashed through a section that had been loosened by years of weathering and neglect. The impact sounded like thunder, like something ominous and final. The fence board splintered. Rex was through. Inside the yard, 3-year-old Tommy Mitchell had been having the time of his life. His grandmother, Sarah, who was watching him for the weekend while his parents ran errands, had set up the kiddie pool on the back patio. Tommy was wearing blue swim trunks decorated with cartoon fish, and he was absolutely gleeful as he splashed in the 18 inches of cool water. His laughter had been pure and unself-conscious, the kind of sound that embodies childhood innocence and joy. Sarah had left him unattended for just a moment, literally 30 seconds, to grab a fresh towel from inside the house. When Rex crashed through the fence, the dog's barking exploded into the otherwise peaceful afternoon like an alarm bell announcing the end of the world. Tommy, mid-splash, froze. His small body went rigid as he watched this massive black and tan creature burst into his sanctuary, hackles raised, teeth bared, barking with a fury that seemed incomprehensible to his 3-year-old mind. The dog was enormous, at least 10 times Tommy's size, and it was moving directly toward him. Tommy couldn't scream, couldn't run, couldn't cry. His body simply shut down in the grip of primal terror. His muscles locked and he stood in the shallow water, water still dripping from his small fingers, staring at the police dog with eyes wide and unblinking. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He was a small child facing what, in his perception, was a monster. Officer was still 30 feet away when he heard Sarah's scream, a sound of pure maternal terror that cut through the afternoon like a knife. She had seen the dog crash through the fence from her position just inside the sliding glass door, and she ran toward her grandson as fast as her legs could carry her. But Rex was closer to Tommy than she was. The dog, still in an aggressive state, approached the frozen child, its massive frame casting a shadow over the tiny boy. Rex's ears were pinned back, his tail stiff, his entire demeanor one of territorial aggression and chaos. Sarah screamed again, her heart nearly stopping at the sight of her grandchild facing this danger. Officer finally reached the fence, desperately climbing through the broken section he just created, shouting commands that his dog would not obey. It was the most terrifying 30 seconds of Tommy Mitchell's life. The moment Officer finally secured Rex and the dog retreated, the full weight of what had happened crashed down on everyone present. Sarah had scooped Tommy into her arms, and the little boy's body remained rigid, his eyes still locked in that 1,000-yard stare of profound shock. He wasn't crying. That would come later. Right now, he was silent, processing something his 3-year-old mind couldn't possibly understand. Sarah's hands trembled as she held him, her protective fury rising like a tidal wave. Officer appeared genuinely distraught. His face had gone pale beneath his uniform and he kept repeating apologies, his voice shaky and uncertain. "I am so sorry. I don't know what happened. Rex has never. I'm so sorry. Is he okay? Is your grandson okay?" He looked at Tommy, who still hadn't moved or spoken, and his expression crumbled further. He could see the damage, could feel the weight of his negligence pressing down on him like a physical force. He radioed for another unit to respond and assist with securing Rex, who now stood quietly, his aggression mysteriously absent, as if the dog didn't understand what had just transpired either. But Sarah wasn't interested in Officer's apologies. Her mind was racing through 1,000 thoughts, all of them dark and protective. What if she hadn't been inside? What if she'd taken longer to grab the towel? What if the dog had actually attacked Tommy? The what-ifs were suffocating, terrifying, and they crystallized something in her: accountability. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't bad luck. This was negligence, and someone needed to answer for it. Within an hour, after paramedics had checked Tommy over and found him physically unharmed, Sarah made her first phone call. She contacted the Atlanta Police Department's non-emergency line and filed a formal complaint against Officer. She spoke with a dispatcher named, explaining in meticulous detail what had happened. Took down all the information, her professional demeanor never wavering, but Sarah could sense the concern in her voice. A 3-year-old nearly attacked by a police dog was not a routine complaint. That evening, after Tommy had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and began her own investigation. She typed "police dog attack lawyer" into Google and scrolled through dozens of results. Most of the links led to firms that primarily handled personal injury cases. But then she found it: Richardson and Associates, Civil Rights Law. The firm's website featured David Richardson's photograph, a stern-faced man in his 50s with piercing gray eyes and a track record that immediately impressed her. The website listed his cases: a wrongful death suit against the police department in 2019, a civil rights violation case in 2021, and numerous settlements against the city for police misconduct. Sarah picked up the phone and dialed the number for Richardson and Associates. It was nearly 9 p.m. on a Saturday night, but the machine that answered provided an emergency contact number. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before dialing that number as well. To her surprise, David Richardson answered on the third ring. His voice was alert, professional, and immediately attentive when she explained her situation. "Tell me everything," Richardson said, and Sarah did. She described the incident in detail: the collar failure, officer's admission that he hadn't been paying attention, the broken fence, Tommy's trauma. Richardson listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Mrs. Mitchell," he finally said, "what you're describing isn't just a tragic accident. What you're describing sounds like negligence, multiple layers of it. I want to meet with you tomorrow. Can you come to my office at 10 a.m.? The next morning, Sarah brought Tommy with her. Her daughter was flying in from Florida to help, but she hadn't arrived yet. Sarah also brought her phone, which contained photographs she'd taken of the broken fence and the pool area. She brought documentation of the police complaint she'd filed. And she brought Tommy, who sat quietly in the waiting room, coloring in a book while Sarah and David Richardson spoke in his office. Richardson's office was exactly what Sarah expected: lined with law books, photographs of him shaking hands with clients, framed newspaper clippings documenting his victories. But what impressed her most was his methodical nature. He opened a fresh legal pad and began asking questions, his pen moving rapidly across the page as he documented every detail. "The body camera footage," Richardson said, looking directly at Sarah. "Did officer mention that the incident was recorded?" "No," Sarah replied. "I didn't even think about that." "That's our first major piece of evidence," Richardson explained. "Every officer has a body camera now. We'll file a public records request immediately. That video will show exactly what happened: how was holding the dog, the condition of the collar, his reaction time. Everything." Over the next week, Richardson began his investigation in earnest. He filed a public records request with the Atlanta Police Department for the body camera footage from officers' patrol on that Saturday afternoon. He also requested incident reports, departmental protocols regarding K-9 handling, training records for officer, and incident history for Rex. The police department, bound by public records law, had 10 days to comply. While waiting for those documents, Richardson did something else. He hired a private investigator named Carlos to conduct neighborhood interviews. Carlos spoke with neighbors along Avenue, documenting their accounts of what they heard and saw. Most importantly, he collected sworn statements from 3 witnesses who had observed the incident or heard the screaming. One neighbor, Mrs. Wu, had actually seen the dog crash through the fence from her kitchen window and had watched officers' delayed response. Her statement would prove invaluable. Richardson also contacted Dr. Owens, the child psychologist whose name had been recommended by Tommy's pediatrician. He explained the case and asked if she would be willing to begin documenting Tommy's trauma. Dr. Owens, though typically cautious about becoming involved in legal cases, agreed to take Tommy as a patient. She understood that comprehensive psychological documentation might be crucial if the case proceeded to trial. 10 days after the incident, the public records request was fulfilled. Richardson received a USB drive containing the body camera footage from officers' patrol that day. He sat in his office with his paralegal, and they watched the video with meticulous attention. What they saw was damning. The video clearly showed doing a cursory check of the collar, literally a 2-second visual inspection without checking the fit or the clasp mechanism. It showed Rex's aggressive behavior in the vehicle, his decision to open the compartment, and then the shocking moment when the collar slipped free. But it also showed something else that Richardson hadn't anticipated. As was looking at his clipboard before the incident, he was texting. His attention was divided, and after Rex broke free and bolted, there was a clear 5-second delay before began pursuing the dog. Those 5 seconds, Richardson knew, could be crucial in establishing negligence in a legal context. Richardson pulled up the police department's K-9 handling manual on his computer and began reading through the protocols. Section 7.3 was explicit. K-9 handlers must inspect collar fit and security before each patrol. A visual inspection alone is insufficient. Handlers must physically test the collar's tightness and clasp mechanism. Hadn't done this. Section 7.5 stated, K-9 handlers must maintain visual and physical control of their canine at all times in residential areas. Handlers must remain aware of their surroundings and anticipate potential environmental triggers that may cause K-9 agitation. Hadn't done this either. Richardson leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a small smile. This case, he realized, was strong, very strong, but as his mind turned to the legal strategy ahead, he couldn't shake the image of little Tommy sitting in his waiting room, drawing quietly, a 3-year-old who should have been worried about nothing more than when his next popsicle would arrive. That image steeled his resolve. Officer needed to be held accountable, and the police department needed to understand that negligence with K-9s could not be tolerated. The first night after the incident, Tommy woke up screaming at 3 a.m. His mother, Jennifer, and his father, Robert, rushed into his room to find their son sitting upright in his bed, tears streaming down his face, his small body drenched in sweat. His eyes were wide and unfocused, and for a moment he didn't seem to recognize his parents. He was caught between the nightmare and reality, trapped in that terrifying moment in the pool when the massive dog had appeared. "Mommy, Mommy, the dog," he cried, his voice raw and panicked. Jennifer scooped him into her arms, holding him close, whispering reassurances that she herself didn't believe. "It's okay, baby, it's okay. You're safe. Mommy's here, the dog is gone. You're safe." But Tommy was inconsolable. His entire body trembled against hers, and he wouldn't let her go. He clung to her as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. Robert sat on the edge of the bed, his own heart breaking as he watched his son suffer. He felt a profound sense of helplessness, a father's worst nightmare, the inability to protect his child from trauma that had already occurred. The three of them sat together in the darkness for over an hour before Tommy finally exhausted himself into an uneasy sleep. The next day, Jennifer called their pediatrician, Dr. Williams, at 7 a.m. She described the incident and Tommy's night terrors. Dr. Williams listened carefully and then recommended they see Dr. Owens, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma, particularly trauma involving young children. "Early intervention is important," Dr. Williams explained. "The sooner we address what happened, the better the prognosis for recovery." Jennifer got an emergency appointment with Dr. Owens for that afternoon. The office was designed to be child-friendly, pastel walls, soft carpeting, toys scattered artfully throughout, and a calm that seemed designed to soothe anxious nervous systems. Dr. Owens herself was a woman in her late 40s with kind eyes and an unhurried manner that immediately put Jennifer at ease. She spent the first 10 minutes talking to Jennifer and Robert without Tommy present, taking detailed notes about the incident, Tommy's behavior before and after, his sleep patterns and his eating habits. When Tommy was brought into the office, he immediately moved to his mother and clung to her leg. Dr. Owens didn't push. She simply smiled and showed him the toys available, saying, "You can play with anything you'd like, Tommy. I just want to get to know you." Tommy didn't play. He sat on his mother's lap and occasionally peeked around her shoulder at Dr. Owens. During that first session, Dr. Owens was assessing Tommy's mental state, looking for clinical markers of trauma. What she observed was concerning. The child showed signs of hypervigilance. His eyes darted toward every sound, every movement. When Dr. Owens moved too quickly toward a toy, Tommy flinched. His baseline anxiety level was significantly elevated. Dr. Owens noted all of this carefully, creating a clinical baseline against which she would measure Tommy's progress, or lack thereof, in subsequent sessions. Over the following weeks, a disturbing pattern emerged in Tommy's behavior. The night terrors continued, occurring 4 to 5 times a week. Jennifer and Robert took turns sleeping in Tommy's room, waiting for the inevitable screams that would pierce the darkness. The emotional toll was immense. Robert began having his own sleep issues, his mind spiraling with guilt and anger. Why had they left Tommy with his grandmother? Why hadn't they anticipated this? These irrational guilt cycles plagued him nightly. Tommy's eating habits deteriorated. Once a boy who had enjoyed meals and snacks with enthusiasm, he now picked at his food, often leaving most of his plate untouched. His mother became worried about his nutrition and consulted with Dr. Williams again. The pediatrician assured them that some appetite loss was normal with trauma, but if it persisted beyond a few weeks, they might need to consider nutritional supplementation. More concerning was Tommy's refusal to leave the house. The first time Jennifer tried to take him outside to their front porch, Tommy's response was visceral and immediate. His breathing became shallow, his body tensed, and he began to hyperventilate. "No, no, the dog might come. The dog might come," he cried, pressing himself against the front door frame, refusing to step outside. Jennifer, alarmed at his panic response, brought him back inside immediately. Tommy had retreated into a self-imposed prison, terrified that another dog might be waiting outside. This agoraphobic behavior extended to other environments as well. When Jennifer attempted to take Tommy to his preschool, a place he had previously loved and looked forward to attending, he had a complete meltdown in the car. His panic attack was so severe that Jennifer had to pull over, and Tommy screamed for 20 minutes before she finally turned the car around and drove home. She called the preschool and explained that Tommy would need to take an extended absence due to a traumatic incident. At Dr. Owens' office during the 3rd week of therapy, something significant happened. Dr. Owens had arranged for a therapy session that would be video recorded, with parental permission. She explained to Jennifer and Robert that video documentation of Tommy's symptoms would be valuable for understanding the full extent of his trauma. As she worked with Tommy during that session, she created gentle scenarios designed to assess his fear responses. "Tommy," she said quietly, "I'm going to play a sound, it's just a recording." "Okay," Tommy nodded, sitting close to his mother. Dr. Owens played a recording of a dog barking, not aggressive, just a normal dog bark. Tommy's response was immediate and severe. His entire body went rigid. His breathing stopped momentarily, and then he began gasping for air. His eyes filled with tears, and he buried himself in his mother's chest, trembling violently. The panic attack lasted for several minutes, and it took Jennifer's soothing presence and Dr. Owens' grounding techniques to help him calm down. When the video was later reviewed by Dr. Owens in her private office, she shook her head slowly. The child's response was textbook post-traumatic stress. His amygdala, the part of the brain that processes fear, had become hypersensitive. A simple sound had triggered a full-blown panic response. She made careful notes. Client demonstrates significant PTSD symptoms including hypervigilance, avoidance behaviors, night terrors, and panic responses to trauma-related stimuli. Prognosis for recovery is guarded given the severity of initial trauma and rapid development of avoidance patterns. Early intervention critical. At home, the situation continued to deteriorate. Tommy began wetting the bed again, something he had 18 months earlier. Jennifer found herself doing laundry multiple times a day. The emotional weight of her son's suffering was crushing her. She had taken a leave of absence from her job as a marketing coordinator, initially planning for it to be temporary. But weeks passed, and she couldn't imagine leaving Tommy in anyone's care, not even a provider. The financial implications were significant. With Jennifer not working, the family's income had been reduced by 40%. Robert, who worked as an electrical engineer, found himself unable to concentrate at work. His productivity plummeted. He missed deadlines and had to be gently reminded of projects he'd forgotten. His supervisor noticed the change and pulled him aside to ask if everything was okay at home. Robert broke down and explained the situation. His supervisor, to his credit, was understanding and allowed Robert flexible hours and occasional work-from-home days. One evening, about 6 weeks after the incident, Jennifer found herself sitting in the dark living room, staring at nothing, tears streaming down her face. Her son, her bright, joyful, innocent son, had been robbed of his childhood security. The simple pleasure of playing outside, of going to preschool, of sleeping through the night, all of these things had been taken from him by one moment of police negligence. The anger she felt was profound, but beneath it was something deeper, a mother's helpless despair that she couldn't fix this for her child. It was in that moment that Jennifer decided something had to change. The lawsuit that attorney Richardson was preparing became more than just seeking financial compensation. It became about accountability, about making sure that what happened to Tommy didn't happen to another child. She reached out to Richardson and told him she wanted to ensure that Tommy's experience would be thoroughly documented, that no detail would be spared in demonstrating the full scope of his suffering. Richardson agreed, and he instructed Dr. Owens to prepare a comprehensive psychological report detailing every aspect of Tommy's trauma and its impact on his development and his family. David Richardson's law office was a carefully curated reflection of his success and determination. Floor-to-ceiling lined with legal volumes, framed newspaper clippings documenting his past victories, and photographs with satisfied clients adorned the walls. But on this particular Monday morning in late July, the office felt more like a war room than a peaceful professional space. Richardson sat at the head of a mahogany conference table with his paralegal, his associate attorney, and a legal consultant named Stephen Price who specialized in police procedure. Spread across the table were dozens of documents, police reports, the body camera footage transcript, photographs of the broken fence, medical records, and psychological evaluation reports from Dr. Owens. "This is solid," Price said, reviewing the documents with a trained eye. "Very solid. The body camera footage is your strongest evidence. You have a clear violation of protocol, the collar inspection, the delayed response time, divided attention, and the department's own manual establishes the standard that was breached. This is textbook negligence." Richardson nodded, but his expression remained serious. "The city's going to fight hard. They always do. They'll argue that police work is inherently dangerous, that accidents happen, that one isolated incident doesn't establish systemic negligence." He paused, steepling his fingers. "We need to establish that this wasn't just one incident. We need to show a pattern." Slid a folder across the table. "I've compiled incident reports for officer over the past 5 years. 3 complaints. 2 involving dogs being off-lead in inappropriate contexts. 1 involving a missed protocol during a search warrant execution." She looked up. "Nothing that resulted in serious injury until now, but a pattern of not following procedure." "And Rex?" Richardson asked. 4 incidents in the past 3 years, reported. 2 noise complaints about aggressive behavior during patrols, 1 complaint about the dog being overly aggressive during a drug detection search, and now this. He tapped the file. The department's own records show they knew there were issues. Richardson leaned back in his chair, processing this information. This was exactly what they needed. A single incident could be dismissed as an unfortunate accident, but a pattern of negligence that was damning. He made a decision. "We're going to file for $2 million in damages," Richardson announced. "We'll claim negligence, emotional distress, violation of civil rights, and failure to maintain control of a dangerous animal. We'll argue for compensatory damages for medical expenses, ongoing therapy, lost wages, and pain and suffering. And we'll argue for punitive damages to send a message to the police department that this behavior won't be tolerated." The room fell silent as the legal team absorbed the scope of what Richardson was proposing. "That's aggressive," said quietly. "The city will come back swinging." "Let them," Richardson replied. "We have the evidence. We have the documentation. We have a traumatized child who did nothing to deserve what happened to him. This isn't about being nice to the police department. This is about accountability." 2 days later, Richardson filed the lawsuit in County Superior Court. The official complaint, 23 pages long, detailed every aspect of the incident, the negligence, and the damages suffered by the Mitchell family. Copies were served to the city of Atlanta and to Officer personally. The legal machinery had been set in motion. The city's response came swiftly and aggressively. Assistant City Attorney Foster, a veteran litigator in her late 40s with a reputation for fierce defense of police procedures, was assigned to the case. Foster had been a prosecutor for 12 years before transitioning to civil litigation, and she approached legal battles with the tenacity of a prosecutor building a criminal case. Her first move was to file a motion to dismiss the lawsuit, arguing that police officers conducting legitimate law enforcement activities were immune from civil liability for incidents that resulted from the inherent risks of their work. Richardson anticipated this move and filed a countermotion arguing that immunity extended only to good faith performance of duties, and that officers' negligence, the failure to properly inspect the collar and his divided attention, constituted a breach of duty that fell outside the scope of immunity. The judge, reviewing both motions, allowed the case to proceed. Foster's attempt to dismiss had failed, but the battle lines were clearly drawn. Then came the media attention. A local news reporter named Martinez, who worked for Channel 7 Action News, had gotten wind of the lawsuit. She did some initial research and realized this wasn't just a routine dog incident. It was a police negligence case with a sympathetic victim, a 3-year-old child who had done nothing wrong. Martinez contacted Richardson's office and asked for an interview. Richardson, after consulting with his team, decided that strategic media attention could work in their favor. The court of public opinion was important, and he wanted people to understand what had really happened. He scheduled an interview with Martinez to take place at his office. When the segment aired on the evening news, it was emotionally powerful. Martinez had interviewed Jennifer Mitchell, who described, with tears streaming down her face, how her son had been traumatized by the incident. She talked about the night terrors, the refusal to leave the house, the therapy sessions. Martinez had also obtained still frames from the body camera footage showing officers' delayed response and the moment the dog lunged toward Tommy. The news segment ended with Martinez's closing statement. The Mitchell family is seeking accountability from the Atlanta Police Department for what they say was negligence that traumatized a 3-year-old child. The city has wrongdoing. The case is expected to go to trial later this year. The impact was immediate and significant. The story went viral on social media. Facebook posts discussing the incident accumulated thousands of shares and comments. Twitter was divided. Some people expressed outrage at the police department's negligence, while others to the defense of law enforcement, arguing that police officers had a difficult job and that this was an unfortunate accident, not criminal negligence. The hashtag #JusticeForTommy began trending on social media, amplified by parents who were horrified at the thought of their own children being in similar danger. Richardson received calls from other families who claimed their children had been traumatized by police dogs, asking if he would take their cases as well. But the media attention also galvanized the other side. Foster went on a local radio show and spoke about the importance of law enforcement and the dangers that police officers faced. She argued that one incident, taken out of context, didn't represent a pattern of negligence or misconduct. "Officer is a dedicated officer with 14 years of service," she stated. "He made a mistake, but that mistake doesn't define his entire career or the entire police department." The police department's internal response was equally significant. Police Chief Daniel convened a meeting with his command staff to discuss the lawsuit, was visibly upset about the public relations damage the case was causing. He ordered an internal investigation into K-9 operations, partly to address the legitimate concerns being raised and partly to gather ammunition for the defense. The investigation cleared the department of systemic negligence, concluding that officers' actions were aberrations rather than examples of departmental policy failures. Officer himself was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the internal investigation. The move satisfied no one. Supporters of the Mitchell family saw it as insufficient. Supporters of the police department saw it as an unnecessary punishment of an officer doing his job. Richardson, meanwhile, was preparing his case with meticulous precision. He began deposing witnesses: Sarah, Jennifer, Robert, neighbors who had heard or seen the incident, and Officer himself. The deposition of Officer was particularly revealing. Under oath and with a court reporter present, admitted to details that undermined the police department's defense. "You didn't physically test the collar's fit?" Richardson asked. "No, I just visually checked it," admitted. "And you were texting when the incident began?" Hesitated. "I was checking the address of the next property." While holding the leash, Richardson pressed. "Yes," said quietly. Each admission was carefully documented, and each one strengthened Richardson's position. By the time the deposition ended, his credibility had been significantly damaged. He left the courthouse looking like a man who understood the magnitude of his mistakes. As summer turned to fall, the case began to take shape. Discovery was completed, meaning both sides had exchanged all relevant documents and evidence. Expert witnesses were being lined up. The trial date was set for May of the following year. Richardson and his team would spend the next 8 months preparing to prove their case. Foster and her team would spend the same period constructing a defense. And Tommy Mitchell, 8 months after that terrifying Saturday afternoon, would continue his slow, painful journey toward healing. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the County Superior Courthouse as attorneys, witnesses, and spectators filed into Courtroom 5B on May 14th. Judge Harold Washington, a man in his mid-60s with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for meticulous fairness, sat at the bench reviewing case files. He had been on the bench for 22 years, and his courtroom was known for its disciplined proceedings and his unwillingness to tolerate theatrics or shortcuts in the pursuit of justice. The courtroom itself was filled to capacity. The Mitchell family sat on the plaintiff's side, with Sarah and Jennifer in the front row, Robert beside them, his arm protectively around his wife. Behind them sat Tommy's preschool teacher, supportive neighbors, and several journalists with notepads ready. On the defense side, Officer sat stiffly in his dress uniform, his face a mask of controlled anxiety. Behind him were representatives from the city's legal department and several members of the Atlanta Police Department, including Chief Daniel, who had come to support his officer. Judge Washington brought the gavel down sharply at 9 a.m. "This is the case of Mitchell versus the City of Atlanta and Officer. Counsel, are you ready to proceed?" Both Richardson and Foster rose and confirmed their readiness. The judge reviewed the procedural rules, admonishing everyone about courtroom decorum, and then nodded to Richardson to begin his opening statement. Richardson stood, and the courtroom fell silent. He was a master of trial presentation, and his opening statement was designed to frame the narrative in the most compelling way possible. He walked slowly between the jury box and the judge's bench, making deliberate eye contact with each juror. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, his voice calm but carrying distinct weight. On a Saturday afternoon in July, a 3-year-old child named Tommy Mitchell was playing in his grandmother's pool. He was doing what 3-year-olds do, enjoying a moment of pure, innocent childhood joy. He was no threat to anyone. He was no criminal suspect. He was a baby. Richardson paused, letting that word hang in the air. On that same afternoon, officer violated department protocol. Not once, not twice, but multiple times. He failed to inspect his police dog's collar properly. He failed to maintain control of his dog in a residential area. He failed to maintain awareness of his surroundings, distracted by his cell phone. And as a result of these failures, a 70-pound police dog broke free and terrorized a child who had done absolutely nothing wrong. Richardson's voice rose slightly, measured emotion seeping through his professional demeanor. He walked to the evidence table and picked up the body camera footage transcript. The evidence will show you exactly what happened. Video evidence, police department protocols, officers' own admissions, and the evidence will show that this wasn't an isolated incident. Officer had a history of protocol violations. Rex, the police dog, had a history of behavioral incidents. And yet nothing changed. Nothing was corrected until a child was traumatized. Richardson then described Tommy's ongoing psychological trauma in clinical but compassionate terms. He mentioned the night terrors, the therapy sessions, the regression in development. "When this trial concludes, I'm going to ask you to hold the defendant accountable, not because police officers don't have difficult jobs. They do, but because accountability matters. And because when we fail our most vulnerable citizens, our children, we cannot simply say it was an accident and move on." Foster's opening statement took a different tone. She was not hostile but measured and reasonable. She acknowledged that the incident was unfortunate but argued that it was an accident, not negligence. She pointed out that officer had 14 years of excellent service. She emphasized that police dogs were valuable law enforcement tools and that one incident, taken in isolation, didn't demonstrate systemic problems. "The evidence will show," Foster said, "that officer followed the procedures available to him on that day. The evidence will show that dogs are animals, and animals sometimes behave unpredictably, regardless of training. The evidence will show that while this incident was regrettable, it does not constitute the level of negligence required for civil liability." Then it was time for testimony. Richardson called his first witness, Sarah Mitchell. Sarah walked to the stand, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. She was composed but clearly affected by the experience. Richardson guided her through her testimony carefully, asking her to describe what she had been doing before the incident, what she heard, what she saw when she ran outside. "I heard a terrible noise," Sarah, her voice trembling slightly. "A dog barking very aggressively. I dropped the towel I was holding and ran to the sliding glass door. I saw this enormous dog. It was so much bigger than my grandson, and it was right over top of him. Tommy wasn't moving. He wasn't crying. He was just frozen. I thought the dog was going to attack him." Foster's cross-examination was respectful but pointed. She asked Sarah if she had ever owned a dog. Sarah said no. Foster then asked if Sarah was qualified to determine whether Rex was actually aggressive or was simply excited and playful. Sarah paused. "It didn't look playful to me," she replied firmly. "The dog looked dangerous." Next, Richardson called Jennifer Mitchell. Jennifer was more visibly emotional than her mother. She described Tommy's condition before the incident, a happy, normal 3-year-old, and then detailed the dramatic changes after. She described the night terrors, the bathroom accidents, the refusal to leave the house. As she spoke, her voice broke several times, and Judge Washington provided her with a tissue box without comment. "He's not my son anymore," Jennifer said at one point, her voice barely audible. "He's a frightened little boy living in fear of something he doesn't understand, and all because of a dog and an officer who wasn't paying attention." Foster's cross-examination of Jennifer was more aggressive. She asked Jennifer if she had been present at the incident. Jennifer said no. Foster then suggested that perhaps Tommy's reaction was being exaggerated by his family's emotional response, that children's reactions could be influenced by their parents' attitudes. It was a risky strategy, suggesting that a mother was amplifying her child's trauma, and several jurors' faces hardened at Foster's implication. Then came Dr. Owens' testimony, and this was where the case truly shifted. Dr. Owens was called to the stand, and she approached her task with the gravitas it deserved. Richardson walked her through her educational background, her credentials, her years of experience treating traumatized children. He established her as an expert, and Foster had no objection to this characterization. Richardson then guided Dr. Owens through her clinical observations. She described Tommy's presentation during their first session: the hypervigilance, the inability to speak about the incident, the panic responses. She explained, in terms that were simultaneously clinical and accessible, what post-traumatic stress disorder was and how it manifested in young children. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Owens stated, "Tommy Mitchell is suffering from significant post-traumatic stress disorder. The trauma he experienced has altered his brain chemistry. His amygdala, the part of the brain that processes fear and threat assessment, has become hypersensitive. Sounds, situations, anything that remotely resembles the original trauma trigger panic responses." Richardson then asked the crucial question, "Is this treatable, Dr. Owens?" "With intensive therapy, yes," she replied. "But treatment for childhood PTSD is typically long-term. We're talking about months to years of therapy, and there's no guarantee of complete recovery. Some children carry the effects of trauma throughout their lives." Richardson then did something that would later be replayed on news broadcasts and discussed on social media. He asked Dr. Owens if she had video documentation of Tommy's therapy sessions. She confirmed that she did, with parental permission. Richardson wheeled a monitor into view, and with Judge Washington's approval, the video began to play. The courtroom fell silent as jurors watched footage from one of Tommy's therapy sessions. The video showed Tommy, small and vulnerable, sitting near his mother as Dr. Owens played a recording of a normal dog barking. The child's response was immediate and severe. His breathing became rapid and shallow. His eyes filled with tears. His entire body began to shake. He couldn't even speak. He could only press himself against his mother, trembling violently. The video lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When it ended, the courtroom remained silent. Several jurors had tears in their eyes. One juror was staring directly at Officer with an expression that was difficult to interpret but clearly negative. Judge Washington continued reviewing his notes, but even he seemed affected by what he had witnessed. Foster's cross-examination of Dr. Owens was gentle, almost respectful. She asked whether other factors could contribute to childhood trauma responses. Dr. Owens acknowledged this. She asked whether Dr. Owens could definitively state that Tommy's condition was solely caused by the police dog incident. Dr. Owens paused and replied that while other factors could contribute, the timeline, Tommy's normal development before the incident, and the sudden onset of severe symptoms immediately after, indicated that the incident was the primary causative factor. By the end of the first day of testimony, something had shifted in the courtroom atmosphere. The evidence was becoming undeniable. Officer looked pale and drawn. Chief sat with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. and the jury members filed out at the end of the day with expressions suggesting that they had heard something they would not easily forget. The trial would continue for 4 more days, but the trajectory had been established. The Mitchell family's case was proving far more powerful and persuasive than the defense had anticipated. Day 2 of the trial began with the courtroom already packed before 9 a.m. Word had spread through legal circles and the media about the power of the previous day's testimony. Judge Washington brought the gavel down at exactly 9 o'clock, and Richardson announced his next witness, Dr. Michael Torres, a nationally recognized expert in K-9 handler training and police canine operations. Dr. Torres was a striking figure, a tall man in his early 60s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding attention and respect. He had spent 30 years in law enforcement before retiring to establish his consulting firm, which trained police departments across the country. His curriculum was impressive: certifications in canine behavior, advanced K-9 handler training, police procedure review, and he had as an expert witness in over 40 cases involving police dogs. Judge Washington qualified him as an expert without hesitation, and Richardson approached the witness stand with purpose. "Dr. Torres," Richardson began, "in your professional opinion, what are the industry standards for K-9 handlers in residential areas?" Torres responded with the precision of someone who had answered this question many times. The National Association of Police K-9 Handlers has established comprehensive guidelines for residential operations. These guidelines require handlers to maintain constant visual and physical control of their K-9 at all times. In residential areas specifically, where children and vulnerable populations are present, the standard is even more stringent. Richardson presented the body camera footage transcript, and Torres reviewed it carefully, making notes as he went. Richardson then asked the crucial question: based on the documented evidence from this case, did officer adhere to these standards? Torres shook his head. "No, not even close. The video evidence shows multiple violations. First, the collar inspection. Department protocol requires a physical inspection. The handler must actually check the fit, test the clasp mechanism, ensure it will withstand the force of a dog lunging or pulling. A visual inspection alone is insufficient. Second, officer was distracted by his cell phone at the moment the dog became agitated. That's a violation of the constant awareness requirement. Third, when the dog's behavior changed, officer's response was delayed. Industry standards require immediate reassessment and appropriate action when a K-9 shows signs of agitation." Richardson walked Torres through the body camera footage frame by frame, and Torres narrated what he was observing with clinical precision. Here, the dog is becoming agitated. Here, the handler looks at his phone instead of the dog. Here, the dog lunges. Here, the collar fails. You can see it slipping. Here is where the handler should have immediately moved to contain the dog. Instead, there's a delay of approximately 5 seconds. In a situation with a police dog near a residential property, 5 seconds is an eternity. Torres then presented data, national statistics on K-9 incidents, comparative data from police departments with stricter protocols versus those with looser standards. His presentation was compelling and authoritative. He showed that departments implementing rigorous handler training and strict residential protocols had significantly fewer incidents involving children or bystanders. "In my professional opinion," Torres concluded, "officers' conduct fell well below the national standard of care for K-9 handlers. This wasn't a minor deviation. This was a significant failure to follow established protocols, any one of which could have prevented this incident." Foster's cross-examination was rigorous. She attempted to challenge Torres' credentials and the applicability of national standards to local police departments. But Torres was unflappable. He had in federal courts, in state courts, and before police commissions. He knew how to defend his expertise. "Ms. Foster," Torres said calmly, "I've trained police officers in 47 states. The standards I'm referencing have been adopted by the vast majority of professional law enforcement agencies. These aren't fringe ideas. These are industry best practices developed over decades of experience and research. Foster then asked if it was possible that a dog could become agitated for reasons beyond a handler's control, that dogs were animals and unpredictable. Torres acknowledged this. Dogs can be unpredictable, he conceded. But a properly trained handler with a well-maintained dog and adherence to protocol can manage that unpredictability. The issue here isn't that the dog became agitated. Dogs do that sometimes. The issue is how the handler responded to that agitation. An officer's response was inadequate. When Torres stepped down from the stand, Richardson could see the impact in the jury's eyes. The expert had provided the technical, professional validation for what the emotional testimony had already conveyed. Officer had been negligent. The city's response came in the form of James, a retired K-9 officer with 30 years of police service. Foster had carefully selected specifically because he could speak to the inherent challenges of police dog work and the reality that accidents did happen. Was likable, grandfatherly even, and his demeanor was designed to remind the jury that police officers were human beings doing difficult jobs. That in his 3 decades of K-9 work, he had experienced situations where dogs reacted unpredictably. He spoke about the stress of police work, the split-second decisions handlers had to make, the reality that following every protocol perfectly was sometimes impossible in the field. "I'm not saying officer did everything perfectly," said in his folksy manner. "But I am saying that what happened was an accident. Dogs are animals. They have minds of their own. Officer is a good officer, and I believe this was a tragic accident, not negligence." Richardson's cross-examination was respectful but pointed. "Mister, you mentioned that handlers should follow protocols. Do you agree that checking a dog's collar before patrol is a basic protocol?" "Yes," acknowledged. "And did officer check the collar properly?" "No," admitted quietly. "So the accident, the dog escaping, wouldn't have happened if officer had followed that basic protocol." Was silent for a long moment. "That's correct," he finally said. It was a small moment, but it was devastating to the defense. Had inadvertently confirmed that the incident was preventable, that it resulted from the defendant's failure to follow procedure. The next day, Richardson called officer to the stand, was visibly nervous as he was sworn in. He wore his dress uniform, but it seemed to hang loosely on him, as if he had lost weight over the past months. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the armrests of the witness chair. Richardson's questioning was methodical and relentless. "Officer, did you physically test your dog's collar on the morning of the incident?" "No," replied quietly. "Did you check the clasp mechanism?" "No." "Did you test the fit to ensure it wouldn't slip if your dog pulled or lunged?" "No, I just visually inspected it." Richardson then asked about the moment the dog became agitated in the cruiser. "What did you do when you noticed Rex becoming agitated?" Paused before answering. "I looked at him and told him to calm down." "Did you immediately pull over and secure him?" "No, I continued driving for about 30 seconds and then pulled over." 30 seconds. That's a long time with an agitated police dog in an enclosed vehicle, isn't it? "I guess so, yes." Richardson then asked about attention at the moment the incident began. "You were looking at your clipboard when the incident started, correct?" Hesitated. "I was checking the address of the next property." "While holding the leash?" "Yes." "So your attention was divided between your clipboard and your dog?" "Yes," admitted, his voice growing quieter. Foster's redirect examination attempted to rehabilitate credibility, but the damage was profound. Had admitted to violating multiple protocols. He had admitted to divided attention. He had admitted to the very failures that had allowed the incident to occur. As stepped down from the witness stand, Judge Washington glanced at the jury. Their expressions had hardened. Several jurors were making notes. One juror was looking directly at Officer with an expression that suggested profound disappointment. The day concluded with presentation of the police department's own K-9 handling manual. Richardson had a staff member read aloud the relevant sections, and the judge allowed these to be entered into evidence as exhibits. The manual was unambiguous. Handlers must physically inspect collars before each patrol, must maintain constant awareness of their K-9s in residential areas, and must respond immediately when dogs show signs of agitation. Every protocol that Officer had violated was right there in the police department's own manual, a manual he had signed, acknowledging that he understood and would follow these requirements. As the day concluded and the jury was dismissed, Judge Washington sat back in his chair and made careful notes. The evidence was mounting decisively in favor of the plaintiff. The defense case, which had started with reasonable arguments about the inherent risks of police work, was being systematically dismantled by the presentation of facts, protocols, and admissions. Richardson returned to his office that evening and reviewed the day's transcript with his team, looked up from her notes and smiled. "We're winning," she said simply. Richardson nodded, but his expression remained serious. "The jury is hearing the evidence. That's all we can ask. Now we need to make sure our closing argument ties it all together in a way they can't ignore." The trial would conclude in 2 days, and when it did, the lives of everyone involved would be forever changed. The final day of trial began with closing arguments, each attorney given approximately 1 hour to summarize the evidence and make their case to the jury one last time. Richardson approached this moment with the gravity it deserved. He stood before the jury box, making deliberate eye contact with each juror, his demeanor solemn and measured. "Members of the jury," he began, his voice carrying the weight of everything that had been presented over the previous 4 days, "you have heard evidence about what happened on July 15th. You have heard testimony from the grandmother who witnessed it. You have heard testimony from the mother whose child was traumatized. You have heard from a clinical psychologist who has documented the severity of that trauma. And you have heard from a nationally recognized expert who explained exactly how Officer violated the very protocols designed to prevent this exact situation." Richardson walked slowly across the courtroom, pausing to gesture toward the evidence exhibits. "The police department has its own manual. These are the rules that Officer agreed to follow when he accepted the responsibility of being a K-9 handler. These rules exist for one reason: to protect the public, and especially to protect vulnerable citizens like children." He then detailed each violation. Officer failed to properly inspect the collar. The evidence shows he did a visual inspection and nothing more. The manual says this is insufficient. Officer was distracted by his cell phone when his dog began showing signs of agitation. The manual says handlers must maintain constant awareness. Officer delayed his response when his dog's behavior changed. The manual says handlers must respond immediately. These weren't mistakes. These were failures to follow procedures that existed specifically to prevent the harm that occurred. Richardson's voice grew more emotional. "Tommy Mitchell is a 3-year-old child. He did nothing wrong. He was simply playing in a pool at his grandmother's house. He had done nothing to deserve the trauma that was inflicted upon him. And that trauma, that profound, documented clinical trauma that you saw on video, was preventable. It didn't have to happen. It only happened because Officer failed to follow the protocols he had agreed to follow." He paused before his conclusion. "When you return your verdict, I'm asking you to hold this officer and this city accountable, not because we want to punish police officers. Police officers do important work, but because accountability matters. Because when we fail to hold people responsible for violating safety protocols, we send a message that those protocols don't matter, and the next child might not survive." Foster's closing argument was professional and skillful, but it was fighting an uphill battle. She acknowledged that the incident was unfortunate, but maintained that it was an accident, not negligence. She argued that Officer was a dedicated officer with years of good service, and that one mistake didn't define his career or warrant the massive damages being sought. Yes, Officer made errors in judgment that day, Foster conceded. But errors in judgment don't constitute negligence. Negligence requires a knowing, deliberate failure to follow procedure. What we have here is a moment of human error, the kind of error that can happen to any of us when we're distracted or rushing. She addressed the jury directly. The question before you is not whether this incident happened. It did. The question is whether Officer's conduct constitutes the kind of negligence that warrants a judgment of $385,000 in damages. I'm asking you to consider that dogs are unpredictable animals, that police work is inherently risky, and that one incident shouldn't result in the financial devastation of an officer and his family. Judge Washington then provided his jury instructions, the legal framework by which they would evaluate the evidence. He explained negligence, the burden of proof, and the different types of damages they could award. His instructions were thorough and fair to both sides, but his tone made clear that he took the case seriously. The jury was dismissed to deliberate at 2:30 p.m. on Thursday afternoon. Everyone settled into the uncomfortable waiting period that characterizes jury deliberations. No one knew how long the jury would take. Some cases deliberate for hours, others take days. Richardson, Foster, and their teams waited in various corners of the courthouse, some going to their offices, others remaining nearby, unwilling to venture far. By 5:30 p.m., the jury still hadn't returned. The courtroom was emptying for the day when word came. The jury had reached a verdict. Everyone rushed back to the courtroom, hearts pounding with anticipation and anxiety. At 6:15 p.m., the jury filed back into the jury box. Judge Washington took his seat and looked toward the foreman, a woman in her mid-50s with a serious expression. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied, handing a sealed envelope to the bailiff, who brought it to Judge Washington. Washington opened the envelope carefully, reviewed the contents, and his face remained impassive as he handed it to his clerk to read aloud. The courtroom was silent enough to hear a pin drop. "We find the city of Atlanta an officer jointly and severally liable for negligence," the clerk announced. "We award compensatory damages in the amount of $385,000 to the plaintiff, the family of Tommy Mitchell." For a moment the courtroom seemed frozen. Then Jennifer Mitchell made a sound, part sob, part gasp, and buried her face in her hands. Sarah reached over and gripped her daughter's hand. Robert sat back in his chair, his eyes closing with relief. On the defense side, Officer's face had gone pale. Chief sat rigid, his expression unreadable but clearly troubled. Judge Washington thanked the jury and excused them. As they filed out, several jurors were crying. One juror who made eye contact with Tommy's family nodded slightly, as if to say, "We heard you." But then something unusual happened. Judge Washington looked at both attorneys and said, "Counsel, I need to speak with you in my chambers. Now." Richardson and Foster exchanged confused glances but gathered their materials and followed the judge off the bench. In chambers, with the court reporter present, Judge Washington sat behind his desk and removed his reading glasses. His expression was troubled, something more than simply rendering a verdict. "I have been on this bench for 22 years, Judge Washington began slowly, his voice heavy with emotion. 22 years. I have presided over hundreds of cases, civil disputes, criminal matters, everything in between." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What I heard in that courtroom over the past 4 days, what I witnessed," he paused again, and his voice grew firmer. "I cannot believe what I heard. A 3-year-old child, terrorized by a police officer's negligence. A dog that broke free because an officer couldn't be bothered to properly inspect a collar. This isn't just a legal question that we can resolve with jury instructions and verdicts. This is a fundamental failure of the system to protect our most vulnerable citizens. Judge Washington looked directly at Foster. Your client's department has policies for a reason. Those policies exist because experience has shown that when they're ignored, people get hurt. And in this case, a child was hurt. He then looked at both attorneys. I'm making a formal recommendation, and I mean a recommendation from this bench to the police department, that this case precipitate a comprehensive review of all K-9 operations. The department needs to implement mandatory retraining for all K-9 handlers. The department needs to establish new protocols for residential operations. And the department needs to take this case as a wake-up call that what happened on July 15th cannot happen again. Judge Washington put his glasses back on and looked at his court reporter. That's going into the record, he said firmly. I want this documented. I want everyone to understand that this verdict is about more than just one case. This is about systemic accountability. Foster looked like she wanted to protest, but she remained silent. Richardson's expression was one of vindication, but also something deeper, a recognition that the judge had just given his implicit blessing to the judgment and had called for systemic change. As both attorneys left the judge's chambers, Richardson turned to Foster and said quietly, "That was extraordinary." "That was unprecedented," Foster replied, her own expression conflicted. "He's essentially criticized the entire department from the bench." By the next morning, Judge Washington's chamber's remarks had leaked to the media. News outlets reported on the verdict and, more importantly, on the judge's stunning criticism of the police department. The story went viral on social media. Legal analysts discussed the unusual nature of the judge's comments, and within the Atlanta Police Department, shock waves reverberated through the ranks. Police Chief Daniel was summoned to an emergency meeting with the city's mayor and the police commission. By that afternoon, had announced that an external review of K-9 operations would be commissioned immediately. Officer was suspended indefinitely pending the completion of a comprehensive internal investigation. The verdict had been rendered, the judge had spoken, and the machinery for systemic change had begun to turn. The weeks following the verdict were transformative and chaotic in equal measure. Within 48 hours of Judge Washington's public criticism, Atlanta Police Chief Daniel held a press conference announcing a comprehensive review of all K-9 operations. Stood before a bank of microphones, his expression grave, and acknowledged that the verdict and the judge's concerns had forced the department to confront serious deficiencies in its K-9 handling protocols. "Officers' conduct fell short of our standards," stated, a difficult admission that signaled to the department that accountability was not negotiable. "We are committed to ensuring that what happened to the Mitchell family never happens again. Effective immediately, we are suspending all K-9 patrols pending the completion of an external review of our operations." The suspension was shocking. No K-9 units patrolling the city meant that a significant law enforcement capability had been temporarily removed. But understood the political and public relations calculus. The department had to demonstrate its commitment to reform or face even greater public pressure. He contracted with a nationally recognized police practices consulting firm to conduct the external review. Dr. Michael Torres, the same expert who had so devastatingly against Officer, was hired to lead the external review. Torres arrived in Atlanta with a team of specialists and began the intensive process of examining every aspect of the police department's K-9 operations. They reviewed training protocols, handler qualifications, K-9 health records, incident reports, and departmental policies. Over the next 6 weeks, Torres' team conducted interviews with every K-9 handler in the department, reviewed hundreds of hours of training videos, and conducted ride-alongs with officers and their dogs. The external review's findings were scathing. Torres' final report, released publicly in July, documented systemic failures across the entire K-9 program. Training standards were inadequate. Handler certification requirements were insufficient. Protocols for residential operations were unclear and inconsistently applied. Most damning, there was a culture within the K-9 unit that emphasized the capabilities of the dogs, while downplaying the risks and responsibilities inherent in handling such powerful animals. TORS made 37 specific recommendations for reform, and to its credit, the Atlanta Police Department adopted every single one. New K-9 handler certification requirements were implemented, requiring officers to complete an additional 120 hours of specialized training beyond the existing K-9 course. New protocols for residential operations were established, specifying that K-9 officers must first assess any residential area for the presence of children and must brief dispatch about their intention to conduct K-9 operations before entering such areas. Most importantly, new collar inspection procedures were mandated. Handlers would be required to perform a physical collar inspection before each shift, documenting the inspection in their log, with supervisory spot checks to verify compliance. Officer was required to complete the new advanced handler training before he could return to K-9 duties. 6 months after the verdict, completed the training and was returned to regular patrol duties, but without K-9 responsibilities. His career as a K-9 handler was effectively ended, a consequence of his negligence that would follow him throughout his remaining years with the police department. But the most profound transformations occurred not in police departments or courtrooms, but in a small house on a quiet suburban street, where a little boy was learning to live again. The settlement money 385000 was immediately placed in a trust for Tommy, with his parents managing it for his benefit. A portion was used to establish a comprehensive mental health treatment plan for Tommy, something that would cost approximately $2,000 per month for the foreseeable future. Dr. Owens continued working with Tommy in twice-weekly therapy sessions, while Tommy's parents also participated in family therapy to process the trauma collectively. 3 months after the verdict, there was a breakthrough moment. Tommy's family had been working on gradually exposing him to dogs in a controlled, safe environment. A neighbor, Mrs. Wu, the same woman who had witnessed the original incident from her kitchen window, had offered to help. Mrs. Wu had an elderly golden retriever named Honey, a gentle dog known for her calm temperament with children. Jennifer brought Tommy to Mrs. Wu's yard on a warm afternoon in August. Tommy was terrified. His hands shook as he gripped his mother's hand. They stood at a distance from Honey, simply observing the dog lying peacefully on the porch. Dr. Owens had coached Tommy extensively before this moment, teaching him grounding techniques and helping him understand that this dog was different from the police dog that had terrified him. "That's Honey," Jennifer whispered. "She's sleeping, she's safe." Tommy watched the dog for 10 minutes, his anxiety gradually decreasing. The dog never moved. There was no threat. Slowly, Tommy's grip on his mother's hand loosened. By the end of the visit, he had moved within 5 feet of Honey without panicking. It was a small moment, but it represented the beginning of recovery. Over the following months, Tommy's progress accelerated. The night terrors decreased in frequency. By September, he was sleeping through the night more nights than not. By October, he attended his preschool for a full day without incident. By November, he was going to the playground and playing with other children, his natural childhood joy beginning to resurface. 1 year after the verdict, Tommy's parents took him to Mrs. Wu's house again. This time when Honey approached him, Tommy didn't flinch. The dog, old and gentle, licked his face. Tommy giggled, an actual, genuine laugh, and that sound made his mother cry with joy. He wasn't completely healed. There were still days when loud noises triggered anxiety. There were still occasional nightmares. But Tommy was living, truly living, in a way that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell channeled her protective fury into advocacy. She founded the Safe Neighborhoods Coalition, a nonprofit organization dedicated to establishing national standards for police dog operations. Sarah began speaking at police conferences, connecting with families from other cities who had experienced similar incidents. Her organization documented cases of police dog-related injuries and deaths, compiled data on departmental policies and protocols, and advocated for legislative change. Her efforts bore fruit. Within 2 years, 3 states had passed legislation establishing minimum K-9 handler training requirements and protocols for residential operations. The Safe Neighborhoods Coalition became recognized as a leading voice in police accountability and animal safety. Attorney David Richardson used the Mitchell case as a landmark precedent in subsequent litigation. He took on 2 additional cases involving police dogs, one in Florida, one in California, and in both cases, he cited the Mitchell verdict and the systemic reforms it had catalyzed. The cases settled favorably for the plaintiffs, demonstrating that Judge Washington's decision had created legal precedent with real-world implications. Judge Washington, in the months following the trial, reflected on the case often. He had taken an unusual step in criticizing the police department from the bench, and initially he wondered if he had overstepped. But as he watched the reforms unfold, as he read news stories about the Safe Neighborhoods Coalition, as he learned about Tommy's recovery, he felt vindicated. The judicial system, when functioning properly, could be a tool for systemic change. One vulnerable child, one attentive judge, and one strong legal case had catalyzed reforms that would protect countless future children. 2 years after the verdict, on a warm Saturday afternoon in July, Tommy Mitchell stood in the backyard of his grandmother's house. Sarah was present, as was his entire family. They had invited Mrs. Wu and her dog Honey. Tommy was 5 years old now, a kindergartner who loved to laugh and play. He sat on a blanket next to Honey, petting the old dog's ears, completely comfortable and at ease. Jennifer photographed the moment, her son, previously traumatized, now at peace. She thought about the journey from that terrifying Saturday afternoon when a police dog had terrorized her son, through the dark months of trauma, through the lawsuit and trial, and finally to this peaceful moment. The wound had healed, though scars remained. The Riverside Dog Incident, as it came to be known in police training programs across the country, became a case study in what happens when protocol violations meet negligence and when the justice system functions as intended. It was a reminder that accountability matters, that vulnerable citizens deserve protection, that systemic change is possible when individuals have the courage to demand it. Tommy Mitchell grew up to become an advocate himself, eventually speaking publicly about his childhood trauma and supporting police reform efforts alongside his grandmother. The 3-year-old boy who had been frozen in terror beside a pool had transformed into an adult working to ensure that no other child experienced what he had endured. Justice, incomplete as it always is, had prevailed.